The notification sound from her phone had become as familiar as her own heartbeat over the past 6 months, each ping bringing another wave of hatred from strangers who had decided that Rebecca Santos was the most despicable person in Phoenix, Arizona. She silenced the device without looking at the screen. She already knew what it would say. More death threats, more people calling her a monster, more demands that she leave town and never come back. Rebecca stood at the window of her studio apartment, looking down at the protesters who had gathered outside her building again. Their signs read, "Justice for Michael," and "Lock her up," and "Child killer." She could hear them chanting her name, their voices carrying up 4 stories to where she stood hidden behind cheap curtains, trying to figure out how her life had become this nightmare. 6 months ago, Rebecca had been a respected pediatric nurse at Phoenix Children's Hospital, known for her gentle touch with scared kids and her ability to comfort grieving families. Today, she was unemployed, unemployable, and universally hated for something that everyone thought they understood but nobody had bothered to investigate. The story that had dominated local news for months was simple and devastating. Rebecca Santos, trusted pediatric nurse, had been responsible for the death of 8-year-old Michael Thompson during what should have been a routine surgery. Security. Footage showed her administering medication to the child shortly before he went into cardiac arrest and died. The hospital had fired her immediately, the district attorney had filed charges, and the court of public opinion had rendered its verdict before she'd even had a chance to tell her side of the story. What nobody knew, what nobody had bothered to find out, was that Rebecca had been trying to save Michael's life, not end it. Her phone rang, and she saw her lawyer's name on the screen. David Chen had been the only person willing to represent her after 3 other attorneys had dropped her case due to public pressure and death threats against their own families. "Rebecca, we need to talk. Can you come to my office this afternoon?" "Is it safe? The protesters have been following me everywhere. I'll have you come through the back entrance. But Rebecca, this is important. I think I found something that could change everything." 2 hours later, Rebecca sat in David's cramped office wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap to avoid recognition. The walls were covered with case files and legal documents, but David's desk was clear except for a single manila folder. "I've been investigating the medications that were administered to Michael Thompson the day he died," David said, opening the folder. "What I found is going to shock you." He pulled out a series of documents, hospital records, pharmacy logs, and witness statements that painted a very different picture of what had happened that February morning. "Rebecca, someone had been tampering with the medications in the pediatric ward for weeks before Michael's death. Someone had been replacing life-saving drugs with substances that would cause exactly the kind of cardiac event that killed Michael." Rebecca felt her heart racing as she processed this information. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Michael Thompson was murdered, but not by you. You were trying to save his life with what you thought was the correct medication, but someone had replaced that medication with something designed to kill him." David showed Rebecca the evidence he'd uncovered through months of investigation that the police had never bothered to conduct. Pharmacy records showed discrepancies in drug inventory that had been dismissed as clerical errors. Several other children had experienced unexplained complications during routine procedures, but their cases had been written off as medical anomalies. Who would do something like this? Who would murder children? Someone who had access to the pharmacy, someone who understood medications well enough to know exactly what would cause a fatal reaction, and someone who was careful enough to frame you for it. David pulled out a photograph of Dr. James Morrison, the chief of pediatric surgery at Phoenix Children's Hospital. Rebecca recognized him immediately, the respected surgeon who had been praised in the media for his tireless efforts to save Michael Thompson, who had been the first to point suspicion at Rebecca when the boy died. Dr. Morrison has been under investigation by the medical board for malpractice, but those investigations have been buried. He's also been facing massive personal debts. His wife left him and took half his assets. He's been gambling heavily, and he's been desperate for money. What does that have to do with Michael's death? Michael Thompson's family had a $10 million life insurance policy on him. His parents had taken it out when he was diagnosed with a rare genetic condition that required expensive ongoing treatment. Dr. Morrison was the one who suggested they increase the coverage. Rebecca felt sick as she understood what David was implying. "You think Dr. Morrison murdered Michael for insurance money? I think Dr. Morrison has been systematically killing children for months, choosing victims whose families had substantial insurance policies, and making sure that each death appeared to be either a medical accident or someone else's fault." David showed Rebecca evidence that Dr. Morrison had been present during each of the unexplained pediatric deaths over the past year, that he had been the one to recommend increased insurance coverage for several of the victims, and that he had connections to a network of people who profited from fraudulent insurance claims. "But why frame me specifically?" "Because you were the perfect patsy. You're a nurse, not a doctor, so you don't have the same professional protections. You're Latina in a predominantly white hospital, so implicit bias would work against you. And most importantly, you were the one person who was getting close to figuring out what was really happening." Rebecca remembered the conversations she'd had with Dr. Morrison in the weeks before Michael's death, how she'd expressed concerns about the unusual number of complications they'd been seeing, how she'd suggested they review their protocols and medication procedures. "He knew you were suspicious," David continued. "He knew that if anyone was going to expose his scheme, it would be you. So he decided to eliminate you as a threat by framing you for Michael's murder. But the security footage shows you administering medication that you believed was life-saving, but which had been replaced with a substance designed to kill. Dr. Morrison made sure he was in surgery during the time Michael received the fatal dose, giving himself the perfect alibi." Rebecca felt overwhelmed by the revelation that her life had been destroyed by someone she'd trusted, someone she'd worked alongside for 3 years, someone who had been systematically murdering children while she was being blamed for his crimes. "What do we do now? We take this to the police, to the media, to anyone who will listen. We expose the truth about what really happened to Michael Thompson and the other children. Will anyone believe us? After 6 months of being told I'm a child killer, will anyone be willing to listen to evidence that I was framed?" David was quiet for a moment, considering the challenge they faced. "It won't be easy. Dr. Morrison has spent months building the narrative that you're guilty, and people are invested in that story. But the evidence is overwhelming, and eventually, the truth has to matter." Rebecca left David's office feeling a mixture of hope and terror. Hope that she might finally be able to clear her name and get justice for Michael and the other children who had been murdered. Terror that even with evidence of her innocence, the court of public opinion might never be willing to admit they'd been wrong about her. The next morning, David held a press conference announcing the new evidence and calling for a full investigation into Dr. Morrison's role in multiple pediatric deaths. The response was immediate and polarized. Some media outlets, led by investigative reporter Sarah Martinez from the Phoenix New-Times, began examining the evidence and questioning the original investigation. They interviewed other nurses who had noticed irregularities in the pediatric ward, families of other children who had died under suspicious circumstances, and medical experts who confirmed that the pattern of deaths was inconsistent with random medical complications. But other outlets and much of the public remained convinced of Rebecca's guilt. Dr. Morrison appeared on television expressing his disappointment that the defense was trying to shift blame to him, describing Rebecca as a disturbed individual who was now trying to destroy his reputation to save herself. "I've dedicated my life to saving children," Dr. Morrison told Channel 12 News. "To be accused of harming them by someone who has already been shown to be responsible for a child's death is deeply painful and completely unfounded." The public reaction was swift and brutal. Rebecca's apartment was vandalized, her car was destroyed, and the death threats intensified. A group of protesters tried to storm David's office, demanding that he stop representing her. But Sarah Martinez's investigation was uncovering more evidence of Dr. Morrison's crimes. She found records of his gambling debts, his connections to insurance fraud networks, and his access to the pharmacy where the medications had been tampered with. Most damning of all, she found a former hospital employee who had witnessed Dr. Morrison replacing medications in the pharmacy, but who had been too scared to come forward because Dr. Morrison had threatened to destroy his career if he talked. "I saw him switching the vials," the employee who asked to remain anonymous told Sarah. "I knew something was wrong, but Dr. Morrison was so respected, so powerful. He told me that if I ever said anything, he would make sure I never worked in healthcare again." The employee's testimony provided the missing link in the case against Dr. Morrison. Combined with the physical evidence, the pattern of deaths, and the financial motive, it painted a clear picture of a systematic scheme to murder children for insurance money. The district attorney's office, facing mounting pressure from the new evidence, finally agreed to reopen the investigation. Dr. Morrison was arrested on charges of first-degree murder, insurance fraud, and tampering with evidence. But even with Dr. Morrison's arrest, public opinion remained divided. Many people had become so invested in the narrative of Rebecca's guilt that they were unwilling to accept evidence of her innocence. "It's a conspiracy," one protester told reporters. "They're trying to frame an innocent doctor to protect a killer nurse." Rebecca watched the news coverage from her apartment, feeling a mixture of vindication and frustration. The truth was, finally, coming out, but she realized that for many people, the truth mattered less than the story they had chosen to believe. Her phone rang and she saw an unknown number on the screen. Normally, she would have ignored it. Too many of her calls were from people threatening her, but something made her answer. "Rebecca, this is Maria Thompson, Michael's mother." Rebecca's heart stopped. She hadn't spoken to Michael's parents since the day he died, when they had looked at her with such hatred and pain that she'd felt like her soul was being torn apart. "Mrs. Thompson, I owe you an apology. I owe you the biggest apology of my life." Maria Thompson's voice was thick with tears as she continued. "We've been following the investigation, and we've learned what really happened to our son. We've learned that you were trying to save him, not hurt him. Mrs. Thompson, you don't need to apologize. You lost your child, and you needed someone to blame. I understand that." "No, you don't understand. We didn't just blame you, we destroyed you. We led the campaign against you. We organized the protests. We made sure that everyone in this city knew your name and hated you for something you didn't do." Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to Michael's mother take responsibility for the mob justice that had destroyed her life. "We were in so much pain," Maria continued. "We needed someone to be responsible for Michael's death, and when the hospital said it was you, we put all our grief and rage onto you. We never questioned it, never looked for the truth. We just wanted someone to suffer the way we were suffering. I don't blame you for that. I can't imagine what you went through. But we should have looked for the truth. We should have asked questions instead of just accepting what we were told. Because of our anger, because of our need for revenge, we helped the real killer get away with murdering our son." Maria Thompson's words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She realized that Dr. Morrison's plan had been even more sophisticated than they'd understood. He hadn't just framed her for Michael's murder, he'd turned the victim's family into weapons against her. "Mrs. Thompson, Dr. Morrison is going to be held accountable for what he did to Michael and the other children. That's what matters now. What matters now is that we make this right. My husband and I are going to hold a press conference tomorrow. We're going to tell everyone that we were wrong about you, that you were innocent, that we helped destroy an innocent person's life. You don't have to do that. You've been through enough. Yes, we do have to do that. Because if we don't, people will keep believing the lie. They'll keep hating you for something you didn't do. And they'll keep missing the truth about who really killed our son." The next day, Maria and Robert Thompson held a press conference that was broadcast live across Phoenix. Standing in front of the hospital where their son had died, they publicly apologized to Rebecca and called for the community to support her instead of vilifying her. "Rebecca Santos tried to save our son's life," Maria Thompson told the cameras. "While we were grieving, she was fighting to keep Michael alive. And instead of thanking her, We destroyed her life because we were told she was responsible for his death. We were wrong, Robert Thompson added. We were wrong to blame her, wrong to lead the campaign against her, wrong to turn our community against an innocent person. Rebecca Santos is not the villain in this story. She's another victim of the man who murdered our son. The public response to the Thompson statement was immediate and dramatic. Many of the people who had been protesting against Rebecca suddenly found themselves forced to confront the possibility that they had been wrong, that they had been participating in the persecution of an innocent person. Some people admitted their mistakes and apologized. Others doubled down on their belief in Rebecca's guilt, claiming that the Thompsons had been manipulated or coerced into changing their story. But slowly, gradually, the tide of public opinion began to shift. The evidence against Dr. Morrison was overwhelming, and more victims came forward to describe his suspicious behavior around their children's deaths. Dr. Morrison's trial began 8 months after Michael Thompson's death. The prosecution presented evidence of a systematic scheme to murder children for insurance money, with Dr. Morrison carefully selecting victims whose families had substantial policies and then creating medical crises that would appear to be accidents or the result of someone else's negligence. Rebecca testified about her interactions with Dr. Morrison, describing how he had cultivated her trust while planning to frame her for his crimes. He knew I was suspicious about the unusual number of complications we were seeing, she told the court. He knew I was asking questions about our protocols and procedures, so he decided to eliminate me as a threat by making me the scapegoat for Michael's murder. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Dr. Morrison was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but even with Dr. Morrison's conviction, Rebecca's life remained in ruins. She had been cleared of all charges, but the damage to her reputation was irreversible. She couldn't find work as a nurse, couldn't afford to stay in Phoenix, and struggled with the trauma of having been universally hated for something she didn't do. I know I should feel vindicated, she told her therapist during one of their sessions. I know I should feel happy that the truth finally came out, but mostly I just feel empty. You've been through an extraordinary trauma. You were not just falsely accused of a crime. You were subjected to a sustained campaign of hatred and vilification. That kind of experience leaves deep wounds. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been better if I'd never found out the truth. At least when people hated me, they were passionate about something. Now they just ignore me, like I'm invisible. Do you really believe that? Rebecca thought about the question seriously. No, I guess not. I needed to know the truth even if it didn't fix everything. I needed to know that I wasn't the monster everyone thought I was. A year after Dr. Morrison's conviction, Rebecca moved to Seattle to start over. She found work as a medical aide in a nursing home, a job that didn't require the same level of background checks as hospital nursing. She kept in touch with Maria Thompson, who had become an advocate for victims of medical fraud, and an unlikely ally in Rebecca's efforts to rebuild her life. I think about Michael every day, Maria told Rebecca during one of their phone calls. I think about what he would have become, what he would have accomplished. But I also think about what we did to you, and I'm determined to make sure that never happens again. What do you mean? I mean that we need to be more careful about who we choose to blame when tragedies happen. We need to ask questions, demand evidence, and make sure we're not destroying innocent people in our rush to find someone to punish. Maria Thompson had started a foundation dedicated to supporting people who had been falsely accused of crimes, particularly those who had been victims of mob justice and public vilification. What happened to you was wrong, she told Rebecca. But maybe we can use what we learned to help other people who find themselves in similar situations. Rebecca thought about Maria's words often as she tried to build a new life in Seattle. She had been the villain of the story for 8 months, hated by thousands of people who had never met her, but who had decided she was evil based on incomplete information and manipulated evidence. Even now, with the truth finally revealed, there were still people who believed she was guilty. who thought Dr. Morrison's conviction was part of some elaborate conspiracy to protect her. I learned something important from this experience. Rebecca told a support group for people who had been falsely accused of crimes. I learned that the truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes the truth just gives you a different kind of prison. What do you mean? I mean that even when people know you're innocent, they still remember when they thought you were guilty. They still see you as the person they once hated, even if they intellectually understand that their hatred was misplaced. Do you regret fighting for the truth? Rebecca considered the question. Her life was still difficult, still constrained by the damage that had been done to her reputation. She would never be able to work as a pediatric nurse again, would never be able to live freely, without worrying about people recognizing her as the woman who had once been blamed for a child's death. But she also knew that she had been instrumental in exposing a serial killer, in getting justice for Michael Thompson and the other children who had been murdered. Her willingness to endure public hatred had ultimately led to the truth. No, she said finally, I don't regret fighting for the truth. I regret that it took so long for people to listen, and I regret that even now some people would rather believe a comfortable lie than face a difficult truth. But I don't regret insisting that the real killer be held accountable. Even though it cost you everything? It didn't cost me everything. It cost me my old life, my career, my reputation. But it gave me something more important. The knowledge that when it really mattered, I chose truth over comfort, justice over convenience. As Rebecca left the support group meeting and walked through the Seattle drizzle to her small apartment, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. She had been cast as the villain in a story that had captivated an entire city, blamed for a crime that had broken her heart as much as anyone's. The real villain had been hidden in plain sight, protected by his reputation and status while she absorbed the community's need for someone to blame. It had taken almost a year for the truth to emerge, and even now, that truth was complicated by the fact that many people had been so invested in her guilt that they couldn't fully accept her innocence. She had learned that being right wasn't enough, that having the truth on your side didn't guarantee justice, and that sometimes the most moral choice was also the most costly one. But she had also learned that resilience was possible, that truth could eventually prevail, and that sometimes the people who seem most guilty are actually the ones fighting hardest for justice. Rebecca Santos had been the villain of the story, but nobody had known her side. Now that they did, some people were willing to admit they had been wrong. Others would continue to believe what they wanted to believe. But Rebecca knew the truth, and in the end, that was what mattered most. She hadn't killed Michael Thompson, she had tried to save him. And in the process of clearing her name, she had helped ensure that the man who had murdered him would never hurt another child. That was her side of the story, and finally some people were listening.